Today, we study the Parsha Eikev, which means hearken, listen, obey. It's the 46th Torah portion of 54. So you can see we're nearing the conclusion. We're coming to the end of the line there, if you will, which we also keep track of through the Haftorot of consolation, which this week or today, this morning, we will study from the prophet Isaiah. Before we begin, however, we say the bracha for reading of studying of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. The first triennial, good morning, Ellen.
Good morning.
The first triennial this morning is chapter 7, verse 12, which is where Eikev begins. So again, just as happens frequently, these false divisions were created by Christians in the Middle Ages, and Viet Hanan ends with chapter 7, verse 11, and then we pick up with Eikev in verse 12, and we will study through chapter 9, verse 7. And if you are in Hertz, you will find that on page 780, or whichever Torah Chumash you are using, chapter 7, verse 12. Now, just to digress one moment before we get into this week's Torah portion, good morning, Ken. I hope everyone saw the email I forwarded concerning Viet Hanan, where I discussed how Moses pleaded 515 times, and where you saw that the sources derived 515 from the gematria of Viet Hanan is 515. So that's the source that our sages derived, since it means I pleaded, that Moses pleaded 515 times to God to please let him enter the land of Israel. And as we know, his pleas went unheeded, or not unanswered, unheeded. God always answers our prayers. It's just sometimes the answer is no. So hard for people to understand. You know, they think of God as this great king in the sky that's like a one-armed bandit that always rolls up with 3 cherries every time you push the arm, and that's not how it works. So anyway, we turn to Eikev. Again, means hearken, to listen, to obey. This is part 2 of Moses' second discourse. And chapter 7 deals with humility. Now, this was given in Moab, as you know, before the Jews were to enter into the land. Once Moses passes away and Joshua takes over as the leader. Now, I'm going to read verses 12 to 16, which have to do with the blessings of obedience and the material wealth that will flow if we obey what God is asking of us. And then after I read verses 12 through 16, there's some Hasidic insights in the Kahos Torah that I want to share with you. So let us turn to chapter 7, verse 12, and I'm reading from Rashi and his interpretation, his translations. In the future, as a consequence of your heeding these laws and your guarding and fulfilling them, Adonai your God will guard for you the covenant and the kindliness that he swore to your forefathers. So Hurt says, and it shall come to pass. So in any event, it means sometime in the future. Verse 13, he will love you and bless you and multiply you. And he, of course, capital H, will bless the fruit of your belly, the fruit of your soil, your grain, your wine, your olive oil, the offspring of your cattle, the herds of your sheep, upon the soil that he swore to your forefathers to give you. Verse 14. You will be blessed more than all the peoples. There will not be among you a sterile male or a barren female, nor among your animals. So virility and fertility will abound. Verse 15. Adonai will remove from you all illness and all the harmful diseases of Egypt that you know. He will not place upon you, but he will give them to all your enemies. Verse 16, and the last verse before we look at the Hasidic insights. You will consume all the peoples that Adonai your God is giving you. Do not take pity on them. Do not serve their gods, because they are a snare for you. So with all these material blessings, again, God reminds us that there's a covenantal relationship, and it's based on what God will give us if we in turn are faithful to him. So Hasidic insights, as it says, it comments on if you heed. So, sorry about that. Hold on. Maybe you can see me, but I lost you all. There you are. Bear with me. Okay, my mistake. So here we go with Hasidic insights on the first word, Eikev, if you will heed. Since it talks about in the future, that's the tense it's used. The word used here for, quote, if, Eikev, literally means heal. The unusual phraseology invites a number of interpretations. So now comes three ways to interpret if or heal. Heeding God's instructions will be closely followed by or come at the heels of the reward detailed in the verses that follow. Of course, the verses that I just read to you, 13 through 16. According to this interpretation, the verse would read, quote, on the heels of your heeding. So that's one way to translate it. Another way, another interpretation, the reward for heeding detailed in the verse that follow will be bestowed specifically for fulfilling those commandments that people typically neglect, trample under their heels. According to this interpretation, the verse would read, if you heed even the heel commandments. So if you heed even those commandments which you would typically ignore. Thirdly, the reward for heeding detailed in the verse that follow will be bestowed in the messianic future, the end or heel of history. According to this interpretation, the verse would read, there will be reward in the heel era for your heeding. So whether you have reward in Olam Hazeh, you could also interpret this verse that in Olam Haba, in the Messianic era, you will be rewarded. And then finally, in the era immediately preceding the advent of the Mashiach, when we hear the footsteps of Mashiach, which is in the age, according to some, that we're in now, where we hear the footsteps of Mashiach, the heel, if you will, the Jewish people will return fully to God. According to this interpretation, the verse would read, quote, in the footstep era, you will heed. What exactly is the reward for performing the commandments? Although the text appears to imply that the reward consists only of material blessing and plenty, this cannot be the case, since such a reward would not be commensurate with the tremendous, far-reaching effects of fulfilling the commandments. In other words, there's got to be more to this than just material plenty. The sages point out that even the immeasurable, indescribable delight experienced by the soul in the afterlife is not enough to compensate for just 1 hour of performing God's will in this world.
Yes.
So all the rewards that you would get in the Messianic era would not even be the same as just 1 hour of performing God's will as he outlined it in this world. By fulfilling God's commandments, we connect with God in the most intimate way possible. Remember, mitzvah, the root is savta, and that means connect. So when we perform a mitzvah, it's not a commandment, it's an opportunity to connect the finite to the infinite. And that's why the bliss of doing that is so all-consuming and overwhelming that just 1 hour of fully connecting with God is equal to all the rewards in the spiritual hereafter, according to the sages. It is this very intimacy that is the true reward for performing the commandments, as alluded to in the sages' statement, quote, "The reward for doing a commandment is a commandment." That's what it says in Pirkei Avot. The reward for a mitzvah is the opportunity to do another mitzvah. This refers to the bond forged with God by the commandment itself. The even greater bond forged by the further commandments it leads to, and the deeper bond resulting from the increased quality with which the individual performs it the next time. So, if you've ever had an intimate moment where you felt God's presence around you and within you, and you can capture that moment in time and meditate on that, it can lead to awesome spiritual growth. Hence, the material bounty promised here and elsewhere in the Torah for observing God's laws is not an end in itself, but rather simply the means by which God facilitates our further performance of his commandments. So material blessings are twofold. One, to give you the vitality you need to continue doing God's will. Two, God is testing you by giving you bounty to see what you do with it. Do you keep it for yourself? Do you help others in your community? Do you help the oppressed, the disadvantaged? What do you do with the material bounty that God is giving you? There's a reason that some have more material bounty than others. The reward for doing a commandment is that God will make it easier to do another commandment. Similarly, the material bounty awaiting us in the Messianic era is not an end in itself, but rather the circumstance that will enable us to fulfill God's will and perform the commandments in the most ideal way possible. In the Messianic era, physical life will continue, but awareness of God will be ever present, so that evil will vanish from the earth. It can't exist. There are, of course, many possible motivations for observing God's commandments, many of them quite legitimate. But only if we observe the commandments out of simple devotion to God will we be careful about performing the lighter ones as we are about performing the heavier ones. It's not up to us to say this mitzvah is more important than another mitzvah. We don't know. Some are easier for our intellect to understand than other mitzvot. Our devotion to God will prompt us to seek to serve him completely, fulfilling all his commandments without distinction. In this context, our awareness of which commandments are more vital and which are less so serves only to help us ensure that we are no less scrupulous and enthusiastic in observing the latter than we are observing the former. Thus, it is specifically this uniform approach to fulfilling God's will that focuses on the essential bond with God that performing the commandments affects. Think how easy it is to get up in the morning and thank God for another day of life. And if you're not doing that, why wouldn't you? It's another opportunity to connect to God. Would you go to someone's house who invites you to dinner and not thank them for the bounty that they put on your table? Similarly, why wouldn't you do that in thanking God? In fact, this Parsha, this triennial, we will discuss the root of Birchat Hamazon, the blessing over food. In this light, the first three interpretations of this verse listed above can be seen as complementary aspects of the same idea. So they're just different sides of the same coin. By being equally conscientious about the light and heavy commandments, we affirm we are performing all of them out of pure devotion to God. It's sort of like the chukat, those that our intellect can't understand. Shatnez, mixing wool, not mixing wool and linen. The para adumah, the red heifer. We can't understand them. We do them because God commands them of us. In reward, God provides us with the material means with which to perform them more easily now and will ultimately enable us to fulfill them completely by ushering in the Messianic era. May it be speedily and soon. So let us continue. Verses 17 through 26 outlines Israel's struggles with the Canaanite nations. Again, always keep in mind that the whole book of Devarim is Moses's words, correct, and understanding and restating how we got to where we are. So he's going to discuss the struggles with the Canaanite nations in 17 through 26, which I'm about to read now. 17. Perhaps you may think to yourself, these nations are more numerous than I. How can I dispossess them? Sounds like the spies, doesn't it? Which, of course, we're going to Moses talks about at length, and why he mentioned that as a reason that he couldn't come into the land more than the sin of the golden calf. 18. Do not fear them. Recall well what Adonai your God did to Pharaoh and to all the Egyptians. 19. The great tests you witnessed, the signs and the wonders and the strong hand and the extended arm with which Adonai your God took you out. So will Adonai your God do to all the peoples that you are afraid of. So in the Lubavitch, I want to read verse 19 because of the way it elaborates and weaves the midrash for further explanation. So verse 19 again, the great trials that you saw with your own eyes, in which he dared the Egyptians to test him, the signs by which he confirmed that he sent me to save you. God, that is, sent Moses to save them. The marvels, the plagues, especially the two in which he killed the Egyptians. The mighty hand that he figuratively used to kill their animals with an epidemic. The outstretched arm that he figuratively used to slay their firstborn. All of with which God your God brought you out. So will God your God do all to the people whom you fear. So these Canaanites, God's got your back. No need to be afraid, as long as you believe and you obey. So let's look at verse 20. Now, Rashi doesn't even translate tsir-o, which is the third word in verse 20. Also, that tsir-o will Adonai your God send against them until the destruction of those who survive and hide from you. Now, tsir-o is typically translated as hornets. Hornets are stinging insects. Hornets, wasps, bees are all in the same genera. So Hertz says this about that on page 780. Hornet. A plague of hornets would drive the Canaanites from their hiding places into the open. Some of the species of hornets found in Palestine have their nests in rock caves. There is a novel and illuminating explanation of the meaning of the hornet. It was the badge of Thutmose III, which was a pharaoh, and his successors, and would thus be a veiled reference to the systemic series of invasions and conquests in Palestine undertaken by that pharaoh. These invasions have reduced the fighting power and resistance of the Canaanites. And I can't recall specific examples, but there were other examples in Ketuvim of hornets playing a role in Israelite victories.
Exodus 23:28.
Yeah, there you go.
Send the hornet swarm before you, and it will drive away the Hivite. The Canaanite,
there you go. Thank you, Ken. And it says that right in Hertz's explanations. When all else fails, read the instructions. Thank you for being literate.
So I don't have the Hertz Bible, so sorry.
Well, it must be true. So let's look at verse 21. Do not be intimidated by them. For Adonai your God is amid you, the great and fearsome Almighty. So, however great and fearsome you think these Canaanite nations are, they can't hold a candle to God Almighty. Verse 22. Adonai your God will expel these nations before you gradually. Interesting. He's not going to snap his fingers and all the Canaanites are wiped out all at one time. This is going to happen gradually over time. And indeed, we know that it took 7 years for the Canaanite nations, and not all of them were expelled. There were populations that were left, which continued to be a thorn in our side, or a hornet in our side, as the case may be. You will be unable to exterminate them rapidly, lest the wild animals multiply against you. So there's the reason it's going to happen gradually, and Hertz elaborates on that. On page 781, beasts of the field. Wild beasts as field is used here in the sense of uncultivated territory, so the open areas where there were not walled cities. The country was at no time in the biblical age so settled that the jungle lay wholly beyond the range of ordinary experience. How constant the war of man against wild animals was in ancient Palestine. Think of David's battle with the lion. May be felt from the promise of their being tamed as one of the elements of the Messianic age, according to Isaiah. So, you know, we like to think of Bamidbar as desert, but it's wilderness. And there was still a lot of jungle in the ancient times. So God would allow expelling these native populations gradually so that the people wouldn't be threatened by the lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my. So let us continue reading. Verse 23. Adonai, your God, will defeat them before you and will confuse them with great confusion until they are destroyed. He will put 24. He will put their kings in your hand You will eliminate their name from beneath the heavens. No man will stand up to you until you have destroyed them. 25. Burn the statues of their gods in fire. Do not covet the silver and gold upon them and take it for yourself, lest you be ensnared by it, because it is abominated by Adonai your God. So don't melt down these idols and then use their silver and gold for your own material purposes, because it's ill-gotten gains. Just as the Talmud points out, if money is gained by evil means and then donated to a good cause, it shouldn't be accepted. Bernie Madoff comes to mind, or think of other people who had evil in their hearts or acted evilly and tried to assuage their guilt by becoming a big macher, purchasing a Torah, and that's why during certain presidential campaigns, when it's found out that these people gave money to those campaigns, someone with a moral, ethical compass will return that money. They can't accept it. It's like the old Jewish dilemma where you see a door and it says free food, and you open the door and it's a big ham. So, idols are an abomination. Verse 26. Do not bring abomination into your house, lest you become cherim, like it. They have mouths but cannot speak. They have ears but cannot hear. They have eyes but cannot see, which we read from Tehillim last week. And those who act like them shall become like them. Thoroughly revile and abominate it, for it is cherim. Bad stuff. Stay away. Don't even be tempted. So now, any comments about what we've studied thus far in chapter 7 before we turn to chapter 8? Looks like Bobby got out of his doctor's appointment early and is joining us.
I have a comment.
Yes, ma'am.
As usual.
I would expect no less.
That was prompted by your reading that no man would be able to stand up to the children of Israel, even though they were leaving little by little. That in itself, hopefully, resulted in a number of individuals continuing to trust God with regard to his fulfillment of giving the entire land, because right now there's no bad of the other group that can stand up to us. Therefore, we trust him to continue that until the little, deal has been taken care of, to get all of the land.
So much in life, if you think about it, we are our own worst enemies. And if you think about when Jews are truly united is when there's an outside force against us. And when things are good, materially beneficent, prosperous, that's when we become into factions, disagreements, controversy, which is called machlokas. Machlokas, the Talmud speaks of frequently, which is a controversy or a discussion or an argument. However, again, is it for the sake of heaven or is it not for the sake of heaven? And those things which divide us, which are not for the sake of heaven, are doomed to our destruction. And we only have ourselves to blame. Bob, welcome. Glad you could join us. We're now on chapter 8 of Eikev. Chapter 8 is the fatherly discipline of God and the lessons of the wilderness. And I want to open with what a paragraph from Hertz that'll frame what we're about to read. The long wandering in the wilderness had been designed to teach Israel humility and a self-distrusting reliance on him. In those years, when the Israelites were totally dependent upon God, they had lacked nothing that was essential for their life. Remember, Miriam's well followed them, the clouds of glory, the cloud of fire, the manna. Their clothes never wore out. There were no snakes or scorpions. They were protected along the way. They were in a womb. Now they were about to take possession of a fertile land. Let them take heed not to forget the divine goodness and guidance. So, now we're going to read verse 1, the entire mitzvah. In Hertz, it says, all the commandments which I command you. In the Kahos, in the time remaining between now and your entry into the land, you must safeguard all the commandments I am commanding you today. But let me finish reading verse 1, and then I have an insight from Rashi. So, the entire mitzvah that I am commanding you today, you are to guard so as to fulfill, in order that you live and multiply and arrive to inherit the land that Adonai swore to your forefathers. So Rashi has this to say about the entire mitzvah. This can be understood in its plain sense, whereby the quote, unquote, the entire mitzvah refers to all of the Torah, but there is also a midrashic explanation, which does not accept all of the Torah explanation because of the next phrase, which I command you today. All of the Torah was not commanded on that day. Rather, Midrash understands the entire mitzvah as referring to the complete fulfillment of each mitzvah. So it's not literally all 630 mitzvot, which I commanded you today, because again, that was over a 40-day period to Moses, but that you fulfill completely each mitzvah. So we would read that as a cursory glance and maybe just continue reading, not understanding what the implication, but that's where exegesis comes in and the hermeneutical principles that come into understanding the Torah. Because every word in Torah has meaning, it's there for a reason. So the fact that it only says, if it only said the entire mitzvah, then it would mean, yes, all of them. But then it says that I am commanding you today. So the sages infer from that additional sentence that it means fulfillment of all the mitzvot.
So Stuart, I have a question. So
Yes, ma'am.
In the first sentence, when it says all the commandment, even though the commandment is singular, it really means all the commandments?
Yes, ma'am, because again, all 613 mitzvot, according to the sages, are in the very first commandment. I am the Lord your God.
Okay. And the other question I have
Yes,
is,
ma'am.
these are all the commandments that God told Moses. But now Moses is speaking as if he's the one commanding, not God.
What Moses
Isn't that
is doing,
Moses is simply repeating what God told him in his own
Right.
words. It's a
Correct.
matter of, I'm sitting here looking at everybody, but everybody has a different view of what's being seen. So you're not seeing the same thing that I am. So what Moses is doing is relating what God told him as he saw it.
so when he says, I command you, I will give you, I will do this for you.
That's a capital I either way, but it really refers to God.
yeah, it's
So
Moses' recapitulation, his understanding of what God was saying to him. The whole book of Devarim. Again, you got to keep that in the back of your mind, that the entire 5th book of the Torah
It's
is
all
Moses speaking to the people in a manner that he hopes they'll understand, because remember when we talked about the difference between seeing and hearing. The generation he's speaking to did not see. They did not see and witness the giving of the Torah. They did not see the 12 plagues. They did not see, etc. So Moses has to speak to them in a manner that he hopes will be easier for them to inculcate, to internalize the messages. So that's where he's listened to what I'm saying, since you weren't around to see what we saw. It's sort of like Isaac, the grandson you just referred to. He was not there to see 9/11. Okay, so basically, yes, there's tape of what happened, which they didn't have that benefit of technology back then. But still, even seeing it in videotape is not the same as living through it. To seeing on the television live as those planes came into view and hit those towers, and the feeling that you had when you saw and experienced that. So if you think of it in that regard, your experience with 9/11 versus how you're going to tell your grandchildren about that experience.
it's the difference between God said to me and then repeating it versus I'm telling you what God said.
Yeah, but he never prefaces it and says, this is what God told me. He just says, you should do this, you should do this, you should do this, because, and it,
Yeah, but the whole structure of Deuteronomy is a speech about what God told Moses.
Let's go back
okay.
to Devarim. Okay. These are the words that Moses addressed to all of Israel across the Jordan, as he had in the wilderness on the Arava plain facing Suf. And it goes on. So again, these are the words that Moses addressed to all of Israel. So they're words of admonishment that Moses intended to recount. And that's when he went through the different journeys that the Israelites went through.
You could also, it also is a matter of interpretation of words, because it says, and I'm reading from the Chumash that I have, it says, the entire commandment that I command you today, you shall observe to perform. Well, you could read it, the entire Torah that God commanded you, you shall observe to perform.
Which is basically what Rashi was saying, and the Midrash just took a little different twist on it. Does that help at all?
No, it really didn't. You still look puzzled by it, Janet.
Yes.
No, it's just that
I'm still not sure. Look.
Well, you know me. It's just that when he goes on and he says, these are the things that you should do. And it doesn't really show it in Hertz, but in other places where I read, where it says, I have to remember where I saw it now. It just makes it sound like he's saying it on his behalf, not God, because he never says, God told me this and now I'm telling you.
But
it's as if he's saying it, and I wonder, did that show any humility if he was speaking on his own behalf rather than God's?
No, the whole premise of the entire book of Deuteronomy is that Moses is speaking about what he was told and relating it to the Israelites, because a lot of it's an admonition about what, you got to remember everything that happened in the past, and he's just kind of reiterating it. I mean, some of these just simply go over exactly what happened, and it's really, that's why it's called the repetition of the Torah.
Remember too, Moshe Rabbeinu was the prophet, the greatest prophet who ever lived, who knew God, punim apunim, that he could receive God's word at any time. He didn't work through visions or through hypnotic seizures like the other prophets. So just as Isaiah, when Isaiah spoke, no one was to interpret that that was Isaiah telling the people what they should do, because of through Isaiah, they all knew that he was God's quote unquote mouthpiece, if you will, as were all the prophets. They all spoke for God, and God spoke through them. And that's why a lot of times you would see through the as the prophets will say, "Vaydaber Adonai," as God said. So this is all understood throughout the entire book, that Moses, the prophet, is speaking for God, if you will, in how he interpreted what God had been communicating with him these past 40 years to the people in a way that they would hopefully understand and internalize that message.
In a lot of times, there's a very common sentence that goes throughout much of Bamidbar and Exodus, and it's Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor. God spoke to Moses saying, and then it's what God said.
So let's look at verses 2 to 3, because this is a very important verses that people only use halfway. And you'll understand when I read it. But basically, Moses is saying, recall the entire journey. Okay, let's look at verse 2 and 3. You are to recall the entire way on which Adonai your God led you these 40 years in the wilderness in order to oppress you, to test you, to know what is in your heart. And when sometimes we don't know what is in our hearts until we're tested. That's one of the reasons God tests us. Verse 3, he oppressed you and made you hungry, and he fed you the man, that neither you knew nor your forefathers knew, in order to inform you that not by bread alone does man live. And here's the part that no one ever seems to remember. Rather, by the entire expression of Adonai's word does man live. So when you hear people say man doesn't live by bread alone as an excuse to indulge in more material pursuits and pleasures, that's not what it means. As we said, God gives you material bounty so you can fulfill his will and continue by doing more of his commandments. Rather, by the entire expression of Adonai's word does man live. Now, Hertz, I'm going to read first from Hertz, and then Nechama has some insights I want to share with you. So Hertz has this to say, that man does not live by bread only. Physical food is not the only thing that ensures man's existence. Apart from the normal sustenance, there are divine forces which sustain man in his progress through life. The words in the text are of a wider application than their reference to the manna. They teach that man has a soul as well as a body, and the needs of the spiritual life should not be neglected. This truth is of special importance in an age when in so many countries men are passionately declaring that man can live by bread alone, and that he will. In our hedonistic society, in our secular society, that's what many people are espousing. And the Torah is saying, nothing is further from the truth. Let's read what Nechama has to say about the manna test. So remember the long trek that God led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might afflict you, to know in your heart, and you whether you would keep his commandments or not. When he afflicted you, suffered you to hunger, fed you with manna. So he might afflict you, put you to the test, etc. Both in our Sidra above and in Exodus 16, the manna is described as a trial or test, nisayon, a trial or test for Israel. Remember, there was a double portion on Friday. That was a test. Our commentators have remarked on the unusual nature of this trial. Usually a test or trial is something to be borne, an unpleasant experience or burdensome duty. Abravanel queries. Now, Rabbi Abravanel was a Sephardic rabbi during the Middle Ages, a great Torah exegesis. Here's what he says. Here's the question he asks. What test was implied in the provision of their daily bread in the form of manna, with a double portion on Shabbat Eve? Surely this was a great kindness rather than a test. So he's asking, what do you mean it's a test? This is God being kind to us. This isn't a test. Rashi explains this difficulty in the first context where it appears in Exodus, where the Almighty announced the sending of the manna. Quote, that I may put them to the test, whether they will walk in my law or not, to see if they will heed the precepts connected herewith, that they should not leave over and not go out gathering on the Sabbath, end quote. So Rashi quotes right from the text that indeed God said it was a test. The test was not then in the gift of the manna itself, but in the instructions that accompanied it. So the test wasn't in the manna, but in the instructions, how you're supposed to use it or not use it, when you can gather it, when you can't. The way of the Israelites honored these instructions would serve as a pointer to their loyalty to the divine commands, to see whether they will walk in my ways or not. But by the same token, surely every precept in the Torah can be termed a test or a trial. We may detect, however, in the wording of the text that the trial had nothing to do with the instructions governing the manna, but with the actual enjoyment of the heavenly food. The life of luxury and ease they would enjoy in virtue of the manna would constitute the greatest trial of all. Sforno, another Sephardic rabbi in the Middle Ages, had this to say, that he might put thee to the test, if you will do his will when he grants you sustenance without suffering. So not only are the poor tested in their suffering, but the wealthy are tested in their abundance. In other words, would the Israelites continue to fear God and keep his commandments in times of prosperity? But we may object to this explanation on the grounds that the diet of manna in the wilderness is represented as a burden, an affliction, not as enjoyment. Nachmanides, the Ramban, suggests a more plausible explanation. And here's what the Ramban has to say. The situation in which the Israelites were placed regarding the manna represent a great trial for them, since they entered a desert without food of any sort and with no way out. They were totally dependent on the daily portion of manna, which rained down and melted in the heat of the sun. Remember, it was like dew or coriander. And just like dew evaporates in the sun, so did the manna that was not collected. They hungered for it greatly, but bore all their suffering in obedience to God, who might have led them through an inhabited route. He chose, however, to confront them with this trial in order to test their eternal loyalty to him. So that's what the Ramban has to say in explanation. In other words, Nachmanides maintained that the manna constituted a trial for the Israelites owing to its unusual nature. Neither they nor their fathers had known it. It was an unpopular, strange food which was not given them in abundance and could not be stored. So imagine the faith that it was required for a slave, the slave mentality, to know that their food was good for today, but what about tomorrow? And to have that complete faith and trust in God that the food would come tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Each day was viewed with apprehension by the hungry Israelites who waited expectantly for the manna and were assailed by the doubt it would not suffice. The offer of HaKatav v'HaKabbalah clarifies the meaning of the term trial used in the Bible. Here's what this author has to say. God, who is all-knowing, requires no proof. His trial is rather to prove to the person himself the limits of his own capacities. So God isn't being tested, we're being tested. That I might put thee to the test means that God will bring man into such a situation which he will be able to prove to man himself the extent of his faith and trust in God. The Biur suggests the following approach to our text. And here's what the Biur has to say. By being placed in a position of absolute reliance on the Almighty for their daily sustenance, they would become habituated to trust in Him, and their faith in God would become part and parcel of their nature. That's the hope, anyway. How skeptical are we today? We're all 3 paychecks away from foreclosure. Think about all the poor and needy out there who, with this economy that is going on now, are scared to death that they're going to be thrown out of their homes or their apartments. How would you act in such a situation? What would your faith be? If we understand the manna as symbolizing the dependence of man on his maker, the 2 references to the manna at the beginning and end of the passage we first quoted aptly suit a context which speaks of the wonderful natural wealth of the land they were going to possess. So verses 7 through 11, which we have yet to read, and we will read again. For the Lord thy God brings you to a good land, a land of brooks, of waters, of fountains, a land of wheat, barley, etc., wherein you shall eat bread without scarceness, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills you may mine copper. Beware lest you forget the Lord thy God. We are accustomed to regarding this passage as the classic description of the fertility and other wonderful qualities of the Holy Land. But we must not ignore its other implications. The Torah sings the praises of the land to emphasize, too, the moral dangers and pitfalls that such gifts might bring with them. Although the life of the Israelites in the promised land would no longer be dependent on water being extracted from the rock or on manna dropping from heaven, nevertheless, even the normal rainfall and all the natural gifts of the land were similarly derived from the Creator and not in virtue of their own power and might of their hand. So that's the test. When you go into this fertile land and you all are making a good living, because after all, we know Jews own the world, we own the banks, we own the newspapers, we're all rich. And anytime I'm depressed, I just read an Arab newspaper, which reminds me of that. So when we have all this material abundance, will we then say it's by my hand and by my power that I did this? My sweat, my tears, my blood? Or do we give credit where credit is due? And that's the test of the manna and the test of the land we're about to possess. Again, it comes down, do we thank God for the food He puts on our table every day? Or do we eat it and go, okay, I work for a living. My money bought this food. I don't thank me for that. So these are all questions that only each individual can answer. So verses 7 through 19 is basically the fatherly discipline of God it is necessary to keep vividly in mind, lest in the plenty of the land, God is forgotten. And that's the lesson. So let's read verses 7 through 19. And I'm going to stop along the way, of course, to point out a couple of key verses. So verse 7. For Adonai your God is bringing you to a good land, a land with streams of water, springs and groundwater that emerge in valley and hill. So in other words, you won't have Miriam's well, but you won't be thirsty either, because the land has plenty. 8, a land of wheat and barley, grapes, figs, and pomegranates, a land of oil, olives, and honey. So again, you won't have the manna, you won't have the clouds of glory, but you'll have a fertile land. Yes, you'll have to work the land in partnership with God, but look at the abundance that will come from the fruit of your labors, as long as you give credit where credit is due. Verse 9, a land where you will not eat bread in poverty. You will lack nothing there. A land whose stones are iron, and from whose hills you will mine copper. So here, verse 10 is where the sages derive Birchat Hamazon. You will eat and be full, and you will bless Adonai your God for the good land he has given you. Now Hertz has this to say about that on page 783. Bless, thank. Thou shalt be moved to praise him with a grateful heart. The rabbis understood these words as a command, and based upon them the precept that every meal must be followed by grace, Birchat Hamazon, as the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, which is the psalm for Sunday, Psalm 24. The inhabited land and all who dwell upon it. The Talmud declares, whoever enjoys any worldly pleasure without uttering a benediction of its divine giver commits a theft against God. So if you have all this bounty and you don't thank God for the bounty, it's as though you're stealing it. Again, would you go, if Ellen invited me to her home, please God, when coronavirus is over, and we have a wonderful meal, am I going to show up empty-handed? Am I going to act like it's expected that Ellen invites me and feeds me this beautiful meal? If I do, would Ellen invite me back? Would she feel I show the proper gratitude for the work, the material expense, etc.? I mean, no. We show our gratitude to those who bring us into their home. Well, this is God's home. Why aren't we thanking God? So the grace consists of 4 parts. Thanksgiving for food, for the land of Israel, for the temple, and general praise and petition. In the light of Judaism, the table is an altar. Our table, Shulchan, that's what a table is. Shulchan Aruch, where the halacha, Joseph Caro's seminal work, Shulchan Aruch, means the set table. And our table in our house replaces the altar. And it's holy. And when we have Shabbat around our table, we're engaging in holiness. We're inviting God into our into our home. Wouldn't it be appropriate to thank the giver of all, the sustainer of life? Every meal is hallowed by prayer before and after. The ancient Jewish mystics added a touch of ecstasy to the statutory grace by singing gleeful table hymns, zimrot. So our psalms of praise are to enlighten and inspire and elevate the unique combination in these songs of adoration of God with genial appreciation of good cheer is a product of the Jewish genius, which interweaves the secular with the sacred, spreads over the ordinary facts of life the rainbow of the divine. I'm going to read that again. It interweaves the secular with the sacred, bringing the heaven down to earth. Is we interweaving the material into the spiritual, which again, the spiritual comes down as material. That's God's job, to take the spiritual and bring it into the material world. It's our job to take that material essence and return it to its spiritual origins. That's photosynthesis. That's how the cycle works. Spreads over the ordinary facts of life, the rainbow of the divine. The saintly custom of table hymns was soon adopted for Shabbat by the whole house of Israel. In this way, a Shabbat meal became literally a service of joy and with joy to those who sing and teach their little ones to sing. Always about Lador Vador, always about the little ones. These beautiful hymns and melodies the Shabbat day is, as it was to their fathers of old, a foretaste of, quote, that day which is holy a Shabbat, the rest in life everlasting. Our sages tell us that Shabbat observed properly is 1/60th of what it's like in Olam Haba. That a dream is 1/60th of prophecy, and they go on and on. So verse 10 is the origin of Birchat Hamazon, thanking God for his abundance. Now, verse 11 through 20 is lest you forget. And we discussed this last week, and that's Moses's admonitions, lest you forget. So, bear with me, I forgot to get... Let's read verse 11. Look out for yourself, lest you forget Adonai your God, to not guard his commandments, his laws, and his statutes, and his statutes that I am commanding you today. 12, lest you eat and be full, build good houses and live in them. 13, and your cattle and your sheep multiply, silver and gold multiply for you. Everything you own multiplies. 14. Now here's the warning. And your pride increases. I got this through my efforts, my sweat and blood. No one helped me. I did it all myself. And you forget Adonai your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt from the house of slavery, who led you through the wilderness, the great and awesome one, snake, serpent, scorpion, and thirst where there is no water, who took water out for you from solid rock, who fed you man in the wilderness that your forefathers had not known, in order to oppress you and in order to test you. So there it is. Again, not just in Exodus, but here in Devarim, manna is a test to ultimately benefit you. And you think, 17, my strength and the power of my hand have acquired this wealth for me. Recall, 18, Adonai your God, for it is he who gives you counsel to acquire wealth, in order to establish his covenant, that he swore to your forefathers this day. So I have this book, which I've read from before, called 5 Cities of Refuge. And it's little insights from Lawrence Kushner and the playwright David Mamet. So this is what Lawrence Kushner, Rabbi Kushner, has to say about those verses. You get cocky. You start to think that you're running the show, that you are autonomous and have pulled off a few things, that you are in charge in business for yourself. You are even so shrewd, so clever, so charmed and powerful that you can not only beat the odds, but make them any way you like. Sure, someday you'll die, but not until a ripe old age, and then in your sleep. Surely someone that special can even be permitted an occasional moral lapse without guilt or punishment. The foundation and the root of estrangement from God are the source of all sins, taught Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin, who died in 1900. Again, the foundation and the root of estrangement from God are the source of all sins. Comes from saying that God does not supervise creation and that everything is only happenstance without reckoning, without purpose. There's a saying, I can't remember if it's in the Talmud or not, but it says, everything is ordained in heaven except the fear of heaven. Everything is ordained in heaven except the fear of heaven. In Deuteronomy, as almost always, the idea is set in terms of retribution, guilt, punishment, and covenant. But it's the same idea. Everything comes from God. What is the alternative? That only some things come from God? But then where do the other things come from? The devil? Happenstance? Another God? Ourselves? No. Our freedom from the stifling servitude of Egypt and all her fetish gods was only so that we may now realize and acknowledge a new one of all being. A one who is the source of everything. Sort of really encapsulates it, puts it in perspective. Continuing on. Verse 18, recall Adonai your God, for it is he who gives you counsel to acquire the wealth in order to establish his covenant that he swore to your forefathers this day. 19, when, so not if, but when and if you forget Adonai your God and follow other gods and serve them and bow to them, I testify about you today that you will surely be destroyed. I, Moses, testify about you today that you will surely be destroyed. 20, like the nations that Adonai is destroying before you, so will you be destroyed as a consequence of your not heeding Adonai, your God. Now, you can go, oh my God, Stuart, Devarim, all Moses does is say the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. But think about your own children. I can hear Andrea talking to Jared and Shelby, who's 32 and 29 respectively, saying some of the same things for 32 and 29 years respectively. And I'm sure you all, I see Sarita, certainly, she and Cookie, and I can see others. Oh yeah, sure, I get that. So Moses' time is limited. He doesn't have another 32 years, as it were. He's just got another 30 days, which I believe, I may be wrong, but I think that's the whole book of Devarim is the last month of his life. So yes, he says the same thing over and over again, but he says it in different ways because he doesn't know which message of admonition will resonate with what person or which people. So just like we talk to our children differently, we teach the same moral lesson, but they have different levels of understanding. They have different hot buttons. You know what resonates with them and what doesn't. So you may fashion what you want to say, which is the same thing, in different ways depending on your audience. The way I may speak to you in Torah study is going to be differently and on a different level than the way I may speak when I address the whole congregation. That could be at all different spectrum of the continuum and different levels. So there you have it. So let's look at chapter 9. What's the first two words? Shema Yisrael. Again, I'm thinking of sharing that movie. Snap out of it. Listen. Listen, Israel. You are today crossing the Jordan to come inherit nations greater and more powerful than you, cities great and fortified to the sky. We're going to read about these descendants of giants. So let's look at verse 2. Bear with me. I got to get there in the Kahos. Here we go. Verse 2. As well as great and tall people, the descendants of the supernatural giants whom you know and whom you have heard said by the spies, quote, who can stand up against the descendants of a giant, which was Og, king of Bashan, which Midrash tells us Og was one of the antediluvian giants that got onto the ark outside and held on to the ark until it landed on Mount Ararat and he escaped. So that's the Midrash and how they come to the conclusion that these giants survived the flood. But in any event, what God is saying through Moses is, just because they're taller and more powerful than you and have bigger cities, don't be afraid, because none of that can measure up to me, God. And I got your back. So now, lest you think this was all done for your behalf, God's going to snap you out of that too. Let's look at verse 3. You know today that Adonai your God is the one, capital one, crossing before you a consuming fire. He will destroy them. He, capital H, will subdue them before you. You will expel them and destroy them quickly, as Adonai promised for you. So here we go, verse 4. He's teeing up the ball, and now he's going to hit the ball down the golf course. Do not think, when Adonai your God smashes them before you, saying, quote, because of my righteousness has Adonai brought me to inherit this land, end quote. And because of the wickedness of these nations, is Adonai expelling them before you. So Rashi has this to say about that. Our verse warns against saying that their righteousness and the nation's wickedness gave the Israelites the land. Yet verse 5, which we're going to read in one moment, attributes the inheritance to the nation's wickedness, not to our righteousness, but the nation's wickedness. Right? Excuse me. Rashi reconciles this. Do not say that your righteousness and their wickedness combine to give you the inheritance. It was their wickedness alone which caused them to forfeit the land, thus making it available for you to inherit. It wasn't your righteousness. It's because they were wicked. They sacrificed their children. They defecated as part of their pagan rituals. They tattooed their bodies. They cut and ripped their skin and their hair. They were evil. Scripture above cites God's love of the Israelites as the cause for the exodus and the inheritance of the land. That refers to the historic body of Israel. Our passage, however, refers to those who had wandered in the wilderness, rebuking them for their numerous transgressions, according to Nachmanides. So don't get haughty, thinking, I'm so righteous, this is why God is giving me the land. No, it was because, verse 5, not because of your righteousness and the uprightness of your heart are you coming to inherit the land. Rather, because of the wickedness of these nations, then Adonai your God expelling them before you. And in order to fulfill the matter that Adonai swore to your forefathers, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So it wasn't even through your own merits of righteousness. So if you want to say it was through our righteousness, it was because of the covenant that I made with the patriarchs, not your own personal righteousness. Because God knew that the pagans were these, not all pagans. Again, God speaks to different people in different ways. If you accept the Noahide laws, you are welcome in the tent, under the tent of Israel. If you are evil and wicked, there's no place for you under God. And you will be spurned, you will be repelled, you will be thrown out, you will be rejected. Rather, because of the wickedness of these nations, is Adonai God expelling them before you in order to fulfill the matter that Adonai swore to your forefathers, again, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. 6. Here comes that classic famous line. Know that not because of your righteousness is Adonai your God giving you this good land to inherit, for you are a stubborn or stiff-necked people. A quality that exists down to this very day. Recall, remember, do not forget how you angered Adonai your God in the wilderness from the days you left the land of Egypt until you arrived at this place. You have been defiers with Adonai. And that's, we should have ended at verse 3, but I wanted to continue the thought stream down to verse 7. So
verse 7 is interesting, by the way. It begins, it says, V'chol et tishkach, remember and do not forget.
yes.
That makes, it's a much stronger connotation than just remember. And you see that a lot in Torah when you see repetitiveness.
Well, and there's other places that appears. That's a good point, Ken, because remember is front of mind awareness. Do not forget is back of mind awareness. So basically, you should use both so that you always have that as part of your understanding. The back of mind awareness of not forgetting, the front of mind awareness of remembering. And to Ken's point, that's why it's expressed in the manner that it's expressed. Okay, so we've got 30 minutes to dive into the Haftorah, but before we do, any comments, questions, insights, whatever, as it pertains to what we discussed today?
Just the last comments that were made, the remember and, what was it? And not forget. Right.
You were just trying to prove that point, right, Patricia?
She remembered but forgot.
Okay. The thought that comes to mind, which is expressed as a question, to remember, you can think about the specific thing, front of mind.
Yes, ma'am.
But to not forget is associating with that remembering, because there has to be an association between the remembering and the not forgetting, or forgetting, is it the thought that because of these two things being in conjunction with each other, that it would prompt one to do?
You
Sure.
know, one of the things that Rabbi Epstein always says is that if you look at these verses and you're not sure, put it in your own words. So you could say, don't remember it and keep it in the front of your mind. Keep it available all the time.
So you can recall it at a moment's notice, if I may. You know, there's two iterations of Shabbat. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And then in Moses's recounting of the Ten Commandments, which were in last week's Parsha, observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy. So you can look at it that way too. Remember and observe, remember and don't forget.
Remember and observe has two different connotations, though.
Yes.
Remember it means, observe it means carry out the commandments.
Yes. Correct. Which, of course, alludes back to the entire mitzvah. Anything else before we get into the Haftarah today? Which is
Yes, and that's with regard to the test and the comment that one of the sages made about what's the test? This is a good thing. So what's the test? And then the other sage responded, I think there were more than one that responded with regard to why it's a test. The thing that happened during Exodus, okay, which if you want to survive, you had to do what God said. And there was a motivating factor for people obeying was fear, right out fear. So of course I would obey, let's put it this way. An association with obeying in that situation, they were given instructions about what they themselves were responsible for doing. Okay, so that was two things about the Exodus situation as a because that was a test too. The manna, I think, was a test of responding to the fatherly instinct, fatherly manifestation of the eternal power, responding to his love. Are you going to respond to his love? And that was a test. And, you know, maybe somebody already said this. I don't remember.
well, one sage said the man was a test, and the other sage said, no, that was a gift. It was the instructions that were the test, to not collect go out on
only as much
Shabbat
as
to
you could
collect
use,
manna.
not to collect and not to look for it on Shabbos.
Correct. So, and then
My
again,
point that I'm making is because it's easy to not respond to it's easy to take for granted and not respond to somebody's love. Okay, as was said. And that to me is much more difficult of a test compared to the Exodus situation, that the respond to someone's undeserved love, I guess you can put that, is really what?
I would posit that we're still in Exodus. Okay?
Well,
We're still in
considered
exile.
to be in a Roman exile.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. We're still in exile. And until the coming of the Messiah and the third temple is built and peace will reign, wash over the sea, according to Isaiah. So anyway, we're both saying the same thing, just in different ways.
But I think also you got to remember that God was not just testing the fact that he loved the Israelites. He was also testing to see whether they could learn and understand and keep the commandments as well. There's more to it. It's not
Sure.
it's not
And
taking it.
and the
face
true
value.
test, as I said, with a slave population, okay, you gave me manna today.
What are you going to give me tomorrow?
Do I know if you'll even feed me tomorrow? That's the test. To have faith in God, trust in Hashgacha Pratis, divine providence. And how many of us today are racked with self-doubt? And we're given something today. Does that mean we're going to get it tomorrow? What's our faith? That God is the source of everything. What are you going to believe? As Lawrence Kushner said, that God is only responsible for some things? And if so, what things is God responsible for? And then who's responsible for the other? Happenstance? The devil? You? So it's all comes down to faith in God. And the testing of that faith. God gives us tests. So Isaiah is the second Haftorah of consolation. Once again, as the last week, Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, was the Shabbat Nachamu, the Shabbat of comfort. This is, again, more prophetic consolation over the destruction of the Holy Temple. But there is a thematic thread between the Haftorah and the Torah portion. Now, Hertz is on page 794, and I want to read his opening paragraph before we dive into Isaiah. And it's basically chapter 49, verse 14, with through 51, verse 3. So here's what Hertz has to say. This is the second of the Haftorahs of consolation. These Haftorahs are primarily chosen because of the message of comfort and hope they bring during the weeks that follow the fast of Av. Remember, Wednesday night and Thursday was the 9th of Av, the saddest day on the Jewish calendar. Yet, in addition, there is a fundamental similarity between the teaching of our Sidra and Haftorah. The former stresses the vital duty for Israel to maintain its spiritual identity in the face of Canaanite idolatry. I mean, this is what we read time and time again in Eikev and Viet Hanan before that, and Devarim before that. This, together with the recognition that man does not live by bread alone, and the proper understanding of the divine discipline of suffering, would fit Israel for the role of, quote, the servant of the Lord, end quote, as conceived by the prophet in this and other portions of his prophecies. Again, this is how the prophet understood the word of the Lord that came to him. So let's read first verses 14 through 23, chapter 49, deals with Zion's despondency and consolation. Now remember, he's speaking to an exiled population. The great body of the Jewish people had lost hope of national restoration. They mistakenly thought that Israel's history was definitely closed. Imagine the despondency and despair that this exiled population felt. The Nevi Shekers, the false prophets, told them that God would never destroy the Holy Temple, that they would be successful in their war against Babylonia, and not to listen to Yirmiyahu, because he didn't know what he was talking about. So let's read again what 14 through 23, and I'm going to stop at certain verses for additional commentary. And now, Sion said, so this is the exiled population asking a question or making a statement, if you will. God has deserted me. My Lord has forgotten me. Look at the despair in that sentence. God has deserted me. My Lord has forgotten me. So God is going to answer that statement of despair and despondency. What does God say? Is there a woman who might forget her infant, not have mercy on the child of her womb? Even if they were to forget, I will not forget you. Behold, I have inscribed you on the hands. I am always aware of your walls. So, addressing Israel with words of tender love, God gives assurance that he will never forget Zion. Now, Zion means Jerusalem, means the nation of Israel. The ties between God and Zion are even firmer than the bond between mother and child. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 mothers on right now. Okay? Think of the bond you have with your children. And God's saying, my bond with you is even stronger than that. So this is how he's answering through metaphor, through Yeshayahu, to this despondent population that thinks that God's forgotten them. Verse 17. Your sons were too hasty. They will have to go away from you as ones who tear you down and destroy you. So what does it mean your sons were too hasty? Well, Hirsch, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, the modern Orthodox rabbi who lived 100 years ago and is considered a Talmud Chacham, here's what he says. Alas, many of your descendants have become estranged from God. They could not wait for the promised redemption as a reward for faithful adherence to the divine law. Began to see the Torah as the cause of their oppression or exile. They turned their backs on Zion, sought to tear down the last vestiges of all that the faithful had created to bolster the spread of the Torah spirit. Think of the Hellenistic Jews that tried to undo their circumcision because they wanted to assimilate into Greek society. Verse 18. Now, lift up your eyes all around and see. They will all gather and come back to you. As surely as I live, says God, you will clothe yourself with all of them as with an ornament and attach them to you as a bride. I mean, how promising and hopeful is that? 19. For that which was laid to waste, desolation with you, and the land was itself the source of your own destruction. And if you now become too much for the inhabitants, those to wish to destroy you will remain distant. So it was with you yourself that the source of your own destruction, it wasn't my doing. Remember, it's almost like the flip side of the coin where God told the children, it's not because of your righteousness that you're going to inherit the land, it's because of their wickedness. Well, now God told them through Jeremiah for 40 years, because of your wickedness, you will be exiled from your land unless and until you shuv, return to me, repentant, come back. But that was not to be. So, now here's the message of the early arrivals to the latecomers, because when Cyrus conquered Assyria or Babylonia, the Mede, and allowed the Jews to return and rebuild the temple, very few responded to that call. Something like only a few thousand returned back, and they met a hostile population. For one, the farmers and laborers that were left to maintain the vintage and the farmlands for Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians resented them coming back. For two, the populations that were exiled and placed in Israel didn't want them coming back. So they were met with hostility. So the children of whom you were bereaved will yet say unto your ears, quote, the place is indeed too narrow for me, but come closer to me so I can sit down. So Hirsch says, this is the message of the early arrivals to the latecomers. Although there's no room here for so many of us, do become one with our community. Only then will I take my place there. The verse cites this example of generosity and unselfishness for which the Torah aims to educate its adherents. So Isaiah, of course, is speaking of the ideal population that remained in the land, that they should accept the exiles with open arms, because that's God's will, and that was what the Torah promised. In fact, Jeremiah prophesied that in 70 years the exiles would return, and of course that's what happened. So here comes a complete turnaround in the people's attitudes and beliefs in verse 21. Then you will say in your heart, who bore those for me? I was the one bereaved of children, lonely, exiled, and shunned. Who has raised them? I had remained all alone. Where were these? So Hirsch has this to say. There is such a complete turnaround in the people's attitudes and beliefs that Sion exclaims in wonderment, who has brought these lost children back to me? I myself was deprived of my own freedom, unable to be of help to them. Who has reared them and instilled in them such noble traits? Where were they during their exile? So verse 22. Thus spoke the Lord God, who reveals his loving kindness even in justice. Behold, I lift my hand to nations, and the peoples I raise my banner. And they will bring your sons home upon the arm, and your daughters will be carried upon the shoulder. So verse 23 answers the question that was asked, who bore those for me, in verse 21. Then kings will have been your educators, and their noblewomen your nursemaids, their faces turned downward to the earth. They will now prostrate themselves before you and lap up the dust of your feet. Then you will recognize that I am God, that those who hope in me will not be disappointed. So Babylon, which ruled the world for only a few decades, was humbled by the Persians. And Koresh was seen as Mashiach and foretold that way in the prophetic books as the Messiah, because he allowed the Jews to return. And Darius after him. So verse 24 through 26, now comes the fate of those nations who oppose God's will. Is it possible that a hero's booty be snatched away from him, or the captive saved because he is just? Again, rhetorical questions. For thus said God, 25, even the hero will have such captives taken away from him, and the booty of the mighty will be saved. I will fight the ones who fight you, and I will help your sons. 26, I will have their oppressors consume their own flesh, and they will be intoxicated by their own blood as though it were sweet wine. All flesh will recognize that I am God, your deliverer and redeemer, the power who uplifts Jacob, Yaakov. So infighting will result, and they will destroy themselves by fighting within each other. Experience should have taught Israel's oppressors that by devouring Israel's flesh, it is in reality their own flesh that they consume. They wallowed in what they thought to be Israel's blood, but it turned out to be their own. It is the fatal illusion marking the history of man that the powerful, who deprive the weak of their human rights, become themselves victim of any opponent who proves to be the stronger. In the long run, Israel proved to be the stronger in that it survived all attempts to annihilate the Jewish people. A hostile world recognizes in all that God is, quote, the power who uplifts Jacob, end quote, who elevates his people even during the period of Jacob's sufferings, high above the immorality and brutality that threatened to engulf its daily existence. So all these ancient peoples, all these powerful empires are here no longer, but the Jewish people are. And history continues. Anti-Semitism, as you know, it exists. Not only exists, it's prevalent, and its stokes are being, what is the bellows? Are stoking the fire. But we have to have faith in God that this too, we shall prevail because of God's promise. All the prophetic books, there were thousands of prophets in Israel through a few hundred years, but only a select number of prophets, and then only a select number of their writings made it into the biblical canon. And why is that? Because the message of these prophets and these selections are timeless messages. They speak to all ages and all generations. That is why these prophetic books were included by the men of the Great Assembly in the biblical canon as part of the 24 books of the biblical canon. This message of Isaiah is just as prevalent and right and speaks to us today as it did 2,500 years ago. And the message is the same. And I don't know if you listen to my Wednesday messages that Teresa sends out, my recorded messages, but in light of what we've discussed, I would encourage you, if you haven't, or if you do, to listen to this Wednesday's message. Chapter 50. So I want to read Hertz on page 796 about chapter 50 before we delve into it. Another cause of despondency to the exiles was the doubt. Is the ancient covenant relation between God and Israel still in existence? Has not God, by exiling Israel, divorced Israel? And these are certainly pertinent questions today because we live in exile. The answer is, where is your mother's get, which alone would make the separation final. A get, of course, is of divorce, a decree of divorce from the Beit Din, which alone would make the separation final. It does not exist. Israel, therefore, is still Israel. There is no hindrance to Israel's restoration. So let's read verse 1. It's a very famous verse. Thus said God. So if you think that, as you know from Hosea, who was very prominent in the metaphor as Israel as bride and God as groom, a marriage, if you will, with the ketubah, thus said God, where is it? The get, the bill of divorce of your mother, whom I might have sent away. Again, a rhetorical question. Or who is among my creditors to whom I might have sold you? Behold, because of your sins you were sold, and because of your misdeeds your mother was sent away. So that refers to the exile, the galut that we are in, but God did not divorce us. It's more like a separation. So just like couples who are struggling in their marriage, they may separate for a period of time and then reconcile. They may go to counseling. God is saying, even though I exiled you for your sins, where's the bill of divorce? I never said your history had ended. My promise rings true for all time. So verse 2 and 3 say basically, God saying, I stand at the ready. Why, when I came, was no one there? Why, when I called, was there no one to answer? Was it that perhaps my hand was too short, that it cannot liberate? Or is there not enough strength in me to save? So again, God is asking rhetorical questions, which we know the answer to. Of course not. God can do anything. Behold, I can dry out the sea with my warning, make the rivers in the wilderness, causing the fish to stink for lack of water, to die from thirst. I clothe the heavens in blackness and make sackcloth their covering. Verse 3. So 4 through 9 now refers to the servant of the Lord that Hertz had referred to when I read the opening statement, the consciousness of Isaiah's mission. Now, I want you to listen, because you're going to hear 4 times in verses 4 through 9, my Lord God, Hashem Elohim. If you look at the first 2 words in Hebrew, Hashem Elohim, who reveals his loving kindness, even in justice. So as you know, God's attribute of mercy is in Hashem. His attribute of justice is in Elohim. Gave me a language to awaken a disciple, the disciple being Isaiah, to know how to stimulate the weary to learn the word. He awakens morning by morning, awakens my ear to listen like disciples. So that's the first time. Verse 5, Hashem Elohim, my Lord God, who reveals his loving kindness in justice. Again, a repetition. Has opened an ear for me, and I have not resisted and did not draw back. So Isaiah was receptive to God's message and being God's mouthpiece and relaying this prophecy of redemption, of hope, of please return exiled population, because God did not divorce you. Can a mother forget her baby? Verse 6, I offered my back to the smiters and my cheeks to those who pluck at me. I did not hide my face from abuse and spitting. So Isaiah said, just like many prophets, don't kill me, I'm only the messenger. Well, people didn't like sometimes the message of the prophets, so they would spit in their face. They would abuse them. Jeremiah was beaten. He was thrown in a pit. He was imprisoned. He was finally killed, just like Isaiah was killed by King Manasseh, Hezekiah's son. 7, Hashem Elohim. Number 3, my Lord God, who reveals his loving kindness, even in justice. So God's attribute of mercy is still embedded in his attribute of justice, will stand by me. Therefore, I felt no disgrace. Therefore, I set my face hard like flint. So Isaiah is saying, regardless of how you treated me, Israel, I felt no disgrace. I set my face hard like flint. Sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. although it's not true, but his face became hard like flint. So when they spit on him or they smacked him, it didn't reverberate. For I knew that I would not have to be ashamed. Verse 8. Near is the one who declares me justified. Who will want to contend with me? Let us stand close to one another. Whoever is my accuser, let him step up to me. Verse 9, and the fourth time, Hashem, Chez Adonai, Hashem Elohim, Hashem. Behold, my Lord, God, who reveals his loving kindness, even in justice. There's that familiar formula again. Will stand by me. Who is it who would condemn me? Behold, all of them will wear out like a garment. The moth will consume them. So Hertz has to say this is one of the four passages in the second part of Isaiah that either describe the servant of the Lord or, as here, introduce him as the speaker. Isaiah, that is. These passages are of exceptional beauty, religious depth, but present great difficulties of interpretation. The servant of the Lord is ideal Israel, the sanctified minority who are willing to suffer and die for their faith. They are ready to bear all uncharitableness and persecution at the hands of those of their brethren who may be blind and deaf to the signs of the times, to the fulfillment of God's purposes in regard to Israel and to mankind. So it wasn't just that Isaiah was speaking about himself, but to those who believed in his words, who believed in God, that his promise for redemption, as opposed to the naysayers. And think of it today's world. The faithful are this wide, the naysayers are this wide. So verses 6 through 7, verses 10 and 11. A message of encouragement and warnings based on the song of the servant. Behold, all you others, stoke the fire, gird yourself with sparks, go ahead into the blazing heat of your fire and to the sparks that you have kindled. This came to you from my hand. The most painful privation counters your serene sleep. I'm going to speed up a little bit because I want to get these last couple of verses in. It's already right at time. So in other words, what he's saying is their previous machinations shall recoil on themselves. Listen to me, chapter 51, verse 1. You who strive for righteousness, you who seek God. So now he's speaking again to these faithful. And when times you think, I'm the only one, what can I do? God is reminding you, look toward the rock from which you were hewn, to the drilling pick hammer with which you were dug out from the hole. Look toward Abraham, your father, Sarah, who was to bear you. I call upon him as just one man, but I blessed him and will increase him. And now it concludes. For once, God will have comforted Zion. He will have comforted all her ruins, making her desert like paradise, and her wasteland like a garden of God. Then joy and gladness will be found in her, homage of thanks and the sound of music or the sound of song. So this is what is described as prophetic tense. What that means is many times the prophets speak in the past tense of future events because of their perfect belief that because God said it, it will come to pass. So oftentimes in Tehillim, David HaMelech speaks in prophetic tense, speaks of future events in past tense because he's assured of their eventual coming into being.